The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above the night shift, and Hannah Clarke moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a ghost that nobody remembered to see. She was the quiet one. The invisible one. The nurse who never caused trouble, never shared details about the scars on her hands, never made eye contact long enough for conversation to stick. 23 years old on her nursing credential. 15 years lived before that in places the hospital's personnel file did not list. The antiseptic smell had stopped bothering her years ago. It lived in her scrubs now, embedded in the cotton weave. Her badge clipped to the left pocket read H. Clarke, RN in white letters on a blue background, no photo, nothing to distinguish her from any other night shift nurse pushing a med cart through the corridors of a mid-sized hospital in Savannah. That was exactly how she wanted it. Bed 16 sat in the cardiac recovery wing, past the nurse's station where the 4 pumps beat their steady rhythm like a chorus of metronomes. The patient there was still sedated when she arrived at 2,106 hours, Hannah thought in military time without meaning to any more. The habit burned too deep to shake, his chest still wrapped in surgical dressings, his vitals stable but fragile as spun glass. The post-op orders were standard. Monitor every 15 minutes. Watch for dysrhythmia. Document everything. Routine. She hung the new fur bag with mechanical precision, her movements the product of thousands of repetitions. Gloved hands moved. Tubing connected. The drip chamber filled. Her eyes scanned the monitors without seeming to look at anything, cataloging information the way some people read newspapers. Heart rate 68, regular sinus rhythm, blood pressure holding at 118/71, oxygen saturation 98% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Good. Stable. The way surgery was supposed to go when nobody made mistakes. The patient's file identified him as Commander James Reeves, admitted under Navy health benefits, the surgery performed by Dr. Mercer himself, cardiac valve replacement, routine for a 41-year-old with a history of hypertension. What the file did not mention was why a Navy SEAL was in Savannah at all, or why his medical records came with a security designation that made the administrative staff nervous when they processed his paperwork. Hannah had noticed that detail the way she noticed everything. The way she was trained to notice. The security stamp was a small red rectangle in the corner of his admission form, stamped twice, and there was a phone number underneath that was not the hospital's main line. She checked his blood pressure manually, the old-fashioned way, wrapping the cuff around his left arm and listening through her stethoscope for the Korotkov sounds. His skin was warm. His muscles were hard as cordwood beneath the surface, the kind of physical conditioning that came from years of something most people would never do. A tattoo on his left forearm caught the fluorescent light, a name written in script, the letters precise and permanent. She did not look at it closely. She had learned not to look too closely at things that might mean something. He was still unconscious. The morphine drip ensured that. His eyes moved beneath closed eyelids, REM sleep, or something like it, and his breathing was steady through the oxygen cannula. Hannah made her notes in the chart, 0210 hours, vital stable, patient sleeping comfortably, no signs of post-operative complications, for running clear at KVO. KVO meant keep vein open. Medical shorthand for alive but not urgent. She had lived in medical shorthand so long that speaking in full sentences felt like performing. The next morning, Dr. Mercer arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 07 for 7 hours, moving through the administrative corridor with the kind of authority that made people step aside before he asked them to. He was 53, carried himself like he had been built by money and confidence in equal measure, and had the kind of face that suggested he had never been told no in his life. His shoes clicked on the tile floor as he walked, Italian leather, expensive, the kind of shoes that were meant to be heard. He went directly to the billing department. The billing director, a woman named Patricia Chen who had worked at Cedar Creek for 8 years and wanted to keep doing so, pulled his file without being asked. The numbers did not look right, and they both knew it. Medical device invoices from Meridian Surgical Solutions were running 42% higher than the previous year. The cardiac valve replacement kits that Hannah had assisted with yesterday, the expensive titanium and synthetic fiber combinations that Mercer preferred, were billing out at $47,000 per unit. The material cost, according to the invoices that Patricia had cross-referenced with other hospitals, was closer to $12,000. The difference was being buried in something called proprietary surgical support fees that Meridian billed separately. Mercer's cut, if Patricia had done the math correctly, which she had, was somewhere around $8,500 per procedure. He had performed 43 cardiac procedures in the past 6 months. "We'll need to audit this," Patricia said carefully, because she understood that some conversations could end careers. "We will," Mercer agreed, his voice smooth as expensive bourbon. "Schedule a full materials review. I want to understand where the cost variance is coming from." What he meant was, fix this before anyone finds out. What he also meant was, figure out if anyone else has noticed. Hannah noticed things. That was her problem, though Mercer did not know it was her problem yet. He would find out. The way his jaw tightened when he realized someone was paying attention to more than just the patients. She was 3 days into her observation when the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore: the billing patterns, the recurring names on the device supplier contracts, the surgeries that seemed to correlate with Mercer's schedule in a way that suggested he was choosing cases based on reimbursement rather than medical necessity. She had started asking questions. Small questions. The kind that sounded like a nurse trying to understand the business side of medicine. Questions like, why did we replace Mr. Yates' valve when his ejection fraction was still at 48%? That was a question that should not have needed to be asked. A healthy ejection fraction was 50 to 70%. Mr. Yates had been borderline. The decision to operate was defensible but aggressive. The timeline was suspicious. He had been on the waiting list for 6 weeks before Mercer suddenly decided he needed immediate surgery. She had looked at other cases. Found patterns. Found a system that looked very much like someone had figured out how to make money by creating medical problems that were not quite there yet but would become necessary if you waited long enough and billed aggressively enough. The surgical devices were unnecessary in some cases. In others, they were appropriate. The money, though, was always unnecessary. Hannah kept her observations to herself. She reviewed charts during her breaks, her hand steady, her breathing even, her face showing nothing to the other nurses who occasionally sat near her at the break room table. She did not tell anyone what she was finding. She did not mention it to her supervisor. She did not talk to Dr. Mercer. She simply documented everything in a private notebook that she kept locked in her apartment, with dates and patient names and procedure codes, and she waited to see what was supposed to happen next. Mercer noticed her noticing. That was how it started. He was reviewing the cardiac recovery wing one morning, his white coat crisp as fresh paper, his stethoscope looped around his neck like a medal, and he saw Hannah reading through post-op paperwork with the kind of focused attention that made his stomach tighten. She was looking at discharge summaries, medication lists, procedure reports. The way someone looked at something when they were trying to understand not just what happened but whether what happened made sense. "Catch up on your charting, Ms. Clarke," he said, his voice carrying the assumption that she would understand he meant something else entirely. "Leave it alone. Stop asking questions. Pretend you did not see what you saw." Hannah looked up from the paperwork, her eyes meeting his for exactly 2 seconds before looking back down at the pages in front of her. "I'm reading the notes on Mr. Yates," she said, her voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air. "His post-operative progress. For continuity of care. Mr. Yates was discharged Thursday." "I know," Hannah said. "I was his primary nurse for 3 days. I want to make sure the follow-up care is documented correctly." Mercer's jaw moved the way people's jaws moved when they were biting back the thing they actually wanted to say. "Let me know if you have any questions about the discharge summary. I'm happy to clarify anything." The way he said it meant, do not have any questions. Hannah nodded and returned her attention to the charts. Mercer walked away, his footsteps clicking back toward the administrative corridor, and the small muscles in her shoulders remained exactly where they had been, loose, easy, unconcerned. The tremor in her hands did not appear because she did not permit it. The racing of her heart was simple biology and irrelevant. She continued reading Mr. Yates' notes, line by line, her pen steady as a surgeon's hand, and somewhere in the back of her mind the part of her that was still captain and always would be made a calculation about how much longer she could keep this cover before someone decided she was too much of a liability to keep around. Commander Reeves woke up on the fourth post-operative day with his eyes opening in stages, the world assembling itself around him in pieces. Ceiling tile. Fluorescent light. For stand. The soft hiss of oxygen. His chest hurt in the specific way that meant someone had opened it up and rearranged the contents, and for a moment he could not remember why. Then memory sorted itself out, heart valve. Surgery. Cedar Creek Medical. Savannah. The nurse who came in to check his vitals was the one he had been trying to place since the moment he first opened his eyes and saw her face. Familiar in a way that did not make sense. Dark hair pulled back tight. Hands steady as instrument panels. Eyes that had seen things. The kind of eyes you got from living through years of something that was supposed to kill you. "How's the pain, Commander?" she asked, and her voice was quiet in a way that made him listen harder. 6 out of 10, he said, which was a lie. It was an 8. "I'll increase the morphine." Hannah reached up and adjusted the 4 pump, her gloved fingers moving through the menu system with practiced efficiency. The drip rate climbed from 4 milligrams per hour to 6. That should help with the discomfort. He watched her work, his eyes tracking her movements the way combat training taught him to track movements, noting hand placement, body angle, the small adjustments that suggested experience. She had the muscle memory of someone who had done this thousands of times, but there was something underneath that, something harder. The kind of competence that came from having to be competent in situations where being competent meant people lived and being incompetent meant they died. "Have we met before?" he asked, and something in his mind nagged at him like a stone in a boot. Something about her presence. Something about the way she moved. "No, sir," Hannah said, and her voice remained perfectly level, perfectly professional. "I'm just your night nurse. You're still pretty medicated. The memories get fuzzy sometimes post-op." She was right, and he knew she was right, but the feeling did not leave. He watched her leave the room, pushing the med cart with one hand, and he looked down at his left forearm where the name was written in script across his skin. Valkyrie, the tattoo read. It was an old marking, a call sign from years ago, from a place he did not talk about. From a moment when someone had walked into fire to pull him out of it, and that someone had carried him 3 miles through Helmand province with his chest torn open and had not put him down until the medevac birds came. He had never learned her real name. The chaos of that extraction, the morphine, the blood loss, the way consciousness kept slipping away like water through his fingers, all of it had left him with only the call sign and the memory of eyes that promised him he was going to make it because she was not going to let him not make it. Mercer had made his decision by the end of that week. Hannah Clarke had to go, but she could not just go. If she simply quit or transferred, she might take what she knew with her. She might go to someone in administration. She might reach out to the compliance department. She might decide that what she had seen was worth reporting. So he began to build a case. Not a real case, but one that would look real, that would hold up until she was gone and the records had been sealed and the whole thing was a distant problem solved by someone else in some other office. His first move was strategic. He submitted a formal request to have Hannah reassigned from the cardiac recovery wing to the general medical floor. The request came through official channels, with official reasons. He cited staffing optimization and cross-training requirements. It was the kind of request that no one questioned because it sounded like management, like the boring machinery of hospital administration. What it actually was separation. It moved her away from the cardiac patients. It moved her away from the charts she had been reading. It moved her to a ward where she would see different cases and be too busy to ask the questions that kept making his palms sweat. He did this on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Hannah was being briefed on her new assignment by a charge nurse who seemed apologetic about the whole thing. "It's just a temporary reassignment," the charge nurse said, but they both knew temporary could become permanent very quickly if it needed to. Hannah accepted the change the way she accepted everything, with a single nod and no questions. She was good at accepting things. Years of military training had taught her that resistance was expensive and compliance was often the better strategic choice. So she moved her badge to the general medical floor and began learning 15 new patient charts and integrating herself into a different team dynamic, and she did all of it without a single word of protest. What Mercer did not know was that she had already copied everything. Every chart. Every billing anomaly. Every suspicious procedure. She had photographed the patterns with a phone that was not registered to her name, and she had sent the files to an encrypted email account that existed for exactly this kind of contingency. She had been trained to plan for the moment when her cover would collapse. She had been trained to make sure that when it did, the evidence would survive somewhere that Mercer could never touch it. And she had been trained to wait. The waiting had a rhythm to it. Hannah moved through Cedar Creek Medical's cardiac ward in the precise pattern she'd perfected over 18 months, vitals at 0622, charting by 0640, medication rounds by 0710. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone. Her hands moved without hesitation, efficient and calm, the kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst. Nobody noticed the way she photographed billing invoices with her phone. Nobody noticed the ledger she kept locked in her locker, cross-referenced against surgical schedules and device shipments. She had been trained to make sure that when the evidence surfaced, it would survive somewhere Mercer could never touch it. And she had been trained to wait. The waiting ended at 7:08 on a Tuesday morning. Room for 07 held Robert Castellano, a 73-year-old veteran with a failing heart and a family gathered tight around his bed like a fortress. His daughter Sarah sat in the plastic chair, her hand on her father's shoulder. His grandson Tommy, 14 years old, stood at the window. Hannah had come to check the post-operative dressing on the arterial line Dr. Mercer had placed 3 days prior, a standard procedure, routine, nothing that should have triggered what came next. Dr. Mercer entered behind her. She knew his footsteps before she saw him. Captain Clarke. He didn't use her rank. He used her name like a slur. Perhaps you can explain to the Castellano family why their father received a double dose of his morning digoxin. Hannah froze, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding of what was happening. Her hand stilled over the fall line. She turned slowly to face him. I administered. No. You didn't administer anything. You failed to administer it properly. Twice. Once at 0600. Again at 0615. His voice climbed higher, theatrical, designed to carry. A medication error that could have stopped this man's heart. That should have stopped his heart. Robert Castellano's face drained of color. Sarah's grip on his shoulder tightened. That's not accurate, Hannah said. Her voice was level. Measured. The voice of someone who had learned that composure was a weapon. I charted the 0600 dose. The 0615 entry was Drive Reeves. Are you calling me a liar? The room went so quiet you could hear the 4-pump clicking. I'm stating the documentation. Mercer stepped closer. His eyes held something bright and hungry. The documentation you apparently created. A convenient trail that protects you and implicated a resident. Very clever, Captain. The way he said Captain now, it was a weapon. A label. Or should I say, not very clever at all? Because now I have to wonder what else you've documented wrong. How many of my patients have you endangered? How many families have you terrified with your incompetence? Hannah's jaw tightened. Not visibly to anyone watching closely. Just the smallest tension beneath the skin. She turned back to the medication line and continued her work. I would never, Sarah began. It's all right, Hannah said quietly. Dr. Mercer will clarify the chart. The timestamp is documented. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of someone who had just discovered he could hurt her without consequence. You know what your problem is, Clarke? You think you're smarter than everyone in this building. You think a nursing degree makes you a doctor. You think reading charts makes you competent. He glanced at the family, making sure they were watching. You're not smart. You're not competent. You're a liability. And this family is lucky I caught your mistake before their father ended up in the morgue." He turned and left. The sound of his shoes on linoleum receded down the corridor. Hannah finished checking the arterial line. Her hands didn't shake. She documented her findings in precise, measured script. She didn't look at Sarah Castellano's face, which had shifted from gratitude to something colder, doubt. She didn't acknowledge the way Robert's hand had gone slack on the bed rail. She simply completed her task, stepped back, and walked out of room 407 with the same neutral expression she wore entering it. By 1400, word had spread through the unit like infection. Hannah pushed open the break room door at 1406. 3 nurses were sitting at the table with their lunch containers. They saw her and, in sequence, grabbed their food and left. One of them, Margaret, who had trained her on the first night shift, didn't make eye contact. The room exhaled when the door closed behind them. The smell of reheated pasta and burnt coffee lingered in the silence. She sat down at the empty table. Made herself tea. Pulled out the half sandwich she'd brought from home. The break room was hers now, in the way that leper colonies are exclusively yours. By 1600, her name appeared on the unit disciplinary board in the nurse station hallway. A printed sheet with her signature required. The infraction read, "Failure to follow protocol, medication documentation procedures. Requires immediate retraining." A formal investigation was pending. The shift supervisor, Patricia Chen, delivered the news with genuine sadness. "Hannah, I'm so sorry. He's demanding you complete a medication safety module before you work any more cardiac cases." And Patricia lowered her voice. "He told the chief nursing officer that you've been accessing patient records outside your assigned ward. That you're cross-referencing billing data with medical charts. Did he say why that was a problem?" "No. He just said it was inappropriate. That you don't have authorization to review cardiovascular billing." Hannah nodded. She didn't tell Patricia that she absolutely had authorization. Nursing staff reviewed billing all the time. It was part of standard quality assurance. She didn't tell Patricia that what Mercer was really saying was, "I know you're looking. Stop, or I'll make it worse. Thank you for telling me," Hannah said. By the end of the week, the whisper campaign had crystallized into something solid. The story shifted shape with each telling. Hannah had falsified records. Hannah had a grudge against Dr. Mercer. Hannah was unstable. Someone mentioned that her psychological evaluation on hire had red flags. Someone else said they'd seen her in the parking lot at midnight. What was she even doing here? A resident named Dr. Pierce casually mentioned to 3 medical students that Dr. Mercer was concerned about her mental health. That concern, stated with the right inflection, became "she's crazy. Don't trust her." By the second Friday, when Hannah arrived for her shift, the cardiac ward didn't feel like a place that belonged to her anymore. It felt like a place where she was being slowly excised. A body rejecting a foreign object. Mercer magnified it deliberately. He requested she assist with a routine EKG on a post-operative patient, work normally delegated to a technician, not a nurse. When she completed it perfectly, he questioned her methodology in front of the attending. He changed her schedule twice in 3 days, citing unit needs. He required her to attend a medication safety retraining session, then questioned her competency during the session itself. "Perhaps you should focus less on our billing practices and more on learning how to document correctly," he said, loud enough for the instructor to hear. She bore it all with the same expression. Jaw tight. Eyes forward. Hand steady. What she didn't know was that Mercer's campaign had already triggered something else. Something he couldn't control anymore. Commander James Reeves, lying in bed 16 with a recovering sternum and a morphine haze that made memory slippery, had asked a physical therapist named Marcus why the quiet night nurse with the steady hands wasn't working his cardiac cases anymore. Marcus, who respected Reeves for reasons he didn't fully understand, had asked a resident. The resident had mentioned Mercer's concerns. By Friday evening, Reeves had listened to the ward gossip with the clarity of someone who'd spent 12 years in special operations, trained to hear what wasn't being said, trained to recognize patterns. He'd asked for Hannah by name. She came to his bed around 2200, when the ward was quiet and the hallways belonged only to night shift. "You're avoiding me," he said. "No, sir. I've been reassigned to other cases." He studied her face. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition trying to push through the pharmaceutical fog. "You remind me of someone I knew. Someone who was very good at their job. Someone who saved lives." Hannah checked his vitals without answering. Heart rate steady. O2 saturation 96. Everything holding as it should. "Thank you," Reeves said quietly, "for taking care of me." She turned to leave. "Captain." His voice caught her. Nobody ever called her that. Nobody here knew. "You should know. Whatever Mercer's saying about you, it's not true. I know lying when I hear it." Hannah paused at the foot of the bed. In the blue-gray light from the cardiac monitor, her silhouette could have belonged to anyone. "Get some rest, Commander. You have PT at 0800. She walked out. Behind her, Reeves watched her go, and the familiar weight of a name on his left arm, tattooed in script across 3 inches of scar tissue, suddenly felt heavier than it had in 3 years. The name he couldn't place. The voice he almost recognized. The hands that had carried him across a dust field in Helmand province while his team was being cut to pieces around them. In the hallway, Hannah's phone buzzed. A text from her 14-year-old son, "Mom, can you pick me up after school? I need to talk about my science project." She texted back, "Of course. Picking you up at 3:15. She didn't know that Mercer was watching her access the nursing portal from a computer in the station. Didn't know that he'd already sent an email to the chief nursing officer flagging a pattern of suspicious access to restricted files. Didn't know that the next Monday would bring an official notice requiring her to surrender her hospital badge pending a formal investigation. The waiting was almost over. And she still didn't know what was about to walk through those doors. The code red siren wailed at 0340. Not the practice drill kind. The real kind. The kind that made every nurse at Cedar Creek Medical move like the floor had tilted beneath their feet. Multi-vehicle collision on I-95. 2 semis, a sedan, a minivan. EMS was flooding the ER with patients in intervals, 30 seconds between arrivals, and the trauma bays were already at capacity. Dr. Harrison stood in the hallway barking orders. The on-call surgeon was 43 minutes out from home. 43 minutes in a city where survival counted down in 20s. Hannah moved through the controlled chaos without hurrying. Controlled chaos was something she understood at a cellular level. She had lived in it for 12 years. She had breathed it in places where the ground shook and the sky fell. A 19-year-old came through the ER doors on the 4th ambulance run. Male. Steering wheel imprint across his entire chest. Deep. The paramedic was doing chest compressions as they wheeled him past, but his movements had the hollow rhythm of someone already knowing the rhythm wouldn't matter. Trauma Bay 4. Hannah called out, reading the vitals the paramedic was rattling off like a prayer no one was listening to. Pulse thready. Blood pressure already bottoming. O2 sat at 58 and dropping. "What about the other cases?" Dr. Harrison asked. The question wasn't really a question. "Stable. 2 and 3 are stable," another nurse answered. The attending who was supposed to be handling trauma cases was elbow deep in a leg amputation 2 bays over. The surgical team was still in the OR. The chief surgeon's ETA kept climbing, 43 minutes became 48 became 51. The boy had maybe 19 minutes before his heart stopped asking questions. Hannah wheeled into Bay 4 and locked the door behind her with a soft click that no one else heard because the whole floor was screaming with alarms and voices and the terrible sound of a young man's body giving up. She didn't assess. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't explain. Her hands moved on their own. Trauma shears through scrubs fabric. The garment peeled away, revealing a chest that looked like something had driven through it. The sternum caved inward like the skeleton was trying to fold itself in half. Flail chest. Likely hemopneumothorax. Definitely cardiac tamponade if the bleeding inside was as heavy as the vitals suggested. She could feel the attending on the other side of the glass watching her. Could feel the eyes. Didn't matter. The combat knife came out of the ankle sheath in one motion, muscle memory older than her nursing license by about 8 years. The blade was 7 inches of stainless steel with a crossguard, the kind that fit in a gloved palm and did what hands told it to do when words couldn't travel fast enough. "What are you?" The attending was at the door. She didn't unlock it. The first incision went through the sternum at the 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line. Textbook. Steady. The sound was like cutting through something that wanted to be cut through, that had been waiting for permission. The monitor was flat-lined. Asystole. Dead. But not stopped. She cracked the ribs open with her hands, palms pressing down and outward, the cartilage separating with sounds like tree branches and breaking promises. The boy's chest opened like a book someone finally wanted to read. Blood. Everywhere. The hemothorax had filled the cavity almost completely. She was working in a pool of it. Red running down her arms. Red on the floor. Red on the walls of this young man's anatomy where it didn't belong. The attending had stopped shouting. Had stopped moving. Had stopped existing as a presence in the room and become only observation. Sinus rhythm. That was the lie the monitor told. But the lie was better than the truth had been. She was clamping vessels now. The blood vessels that had been bleeding him out, killing him slower than the impact would have, but killing him just the same. The clamps went on like she was defusing a bomb at midnight, like precision was the only prayer anyone believed in anymore. I need a satin sky clamp. 14-gauge needle. 1 unit of O positive, wide open. She didn't wait for the supplies. Didn't ask twice. The attending had bolted from the door to find them moving with the sudden comprehension that something here exceeded the normal velocity of medical crisis. The understanding that whatever she was doing, it was working. The needle went in for the needle decompression, releasing the pressure building in the pleural space. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a held breath finally breaking. Like relief. O2 sat jumped. 58. 62. The monitor started picking up signals like it was learning to read again. A rhythm. Not a good one. Not a normal one. But a rhythm that meant his heart was remembering how to beat. 68. She was opening a unit of blood, getting it into the boy's arm faster than the 4 could normally handle. Fluid resuscitation for hypovolemic shock. Massive transfusion protocol. Every second was a choice between bleeding out and drowning in your own fluids, and all she could do was pick the option that bought time while the real surgeon finished saving someone else's kid. 72. The attending came back with supplies cradled like they were holy relics. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge the expression on his face that suggested he was watching someone perform surgery with a knife pulled from an ankle and hands that moved like they'd been doing this since before medical school started teaching it. 80. Get me a level 1 rapid infuser. Bear hug a warming blanket. And call up to OR, I need a thoracic surgeon in this bay in the next 6 minutes, not 50. The attending in OR won't. Tell them Captain Clarke called it. Tell them Helmand Province. Tell them they have 6 minutes or I'm stitching this kid closed with dental floss and the liability goes on their license, not mine. The words hung in the room like a detonation. Captain. Helmand Province. The specific weight of names and numbers that meant something. Meant everything. The attending moved. Didn't question. Didn't ask for verification. Just moved like someone had pulled a classified security clearance out of a blood-soaked trauma bay and shown it to him. 88. The monitor was steadier now. Not steady. But steadier. The rhythm was something that looked almost normal to someone who wasn't trained to know the difference. But this boy's heart was doing something that resembled beating. His O2 was climbing like it meant to keep climbing. 92. Stable. 92 and climbing. The first time in 4 minutes his body had made a choice to continue existing. The door to the trauma bay opened. Not the attending. The surgeon. The actual thoracic surgeon, still in street clothes, moving with the kind of velocity that suggested someone had said the magic words, the ones that made protocols rearrange themselves and priorities flip upside down. He stopped in the doorway. Looked at the open chest cavity that had been closed 12 minutes ago. Looked at the field thoracotomy that had been performed with a combat knife and hands that had clearly done this before. Looked at the monitor showing a rhythm that shouldn't exist but did. Did you? 92 and stable. Clamps holding. Pressure's coming up. He needs a real closer and about for units more of O positive, but the anatomy's open and waiting. The surgeon took over at the table. She stepped back. Her hands were red to the elbows. Her scrubs were red. Her face was clean because she'd learned in Helmand province that looking at your own reflection after blood work was a privilege you didn't take for granted. The surgeon looked at her once more. A look that carried a question and knew it wouldn't get an answer. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nurse Clarke," she said, stepping toward the door to let him work. "Just Clarke." She was already washing her hands. The water was hot and red and then clear, and then her hands were clean again, like none of it had happened except that it had. Except that somewhere in her muscle memory was a 19-year-old's chest and the moment his heart decided to keep beating. "Just Clarke," she confirmed. Behind her, through the observation window of Trauma Bay 4, the surgeon began the work that would keep the boy alive long enough for the future to become his problem instead of hers. But that wasn't the worst part. The real damage had already been done. The impossible had already been witnessed. And somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Mercer was already making phone calls. The 19-year-old's chest rose. Fell. Rose again. Sinus rhythm. The monitor sang its mechanical affirmation while the attending surgeon stood frozen in the doorway, his face the color of old bone. Hannah's hands were steady as she stripped off the surgical gloves, each movement precise, deliberate, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. Just turned and started charting as if she hadn't just performed a procedure that didn't exist in her job description, as if she hadn't just pulled a combat knife from the ankle sheath beneath her scrubs where no nurse should ever carry anything like that. The room went dead silent. "Who trained you?" the attending whispered. Hannah didn't look up. "He's stable. ICU bed 14 is prepped. I'll transfer him in 5. Somewhere on the 4th floor, Dr. Mercer was making phone calls. His voice carried through the administrative wing like something metallic and cold. The hospital attorney. The board chair. The credentialing office. Each call a calculated escalation, each word chosen to frame what had happened in Trauma Bay 3 as a violation so severe it couldn't be contained. An unauthorized procedure. Reckless endangerment disguised as heroics. A nurse who had exceeded her scope of practice by roughly 1,000 miles. By 0 for 11, the decision was already made. It wasn't even a question anymore. Just a matter of paperwork and timing. Hannah knew. She always knew. The way Mercer's voice changed when he walked past her station at 0420, the way his footsteps didn't hesitate, that meant the calls were done. That meant the machinery was already in motion. She continued her charting without breaking stride. Her O2 levels were documented to the decimal. Her timeline was precise. Every step recorded in her own handwriting. If he wanted to come at her, she had made certain there would be a perfect paper trail showing exactly what she'd done and why. A captain in the Navy doesn't survive Helmand province without understanding documentation. Without knowing that the truth, recorded carefully, was her best defense and possibly her only one. He found her in the ICU corridor at 0438. "Your badge," Mercer said. "Not a question." Not even particularly loud. Just a statement of fact delivered with the confidence of a man who had already called her enemies and collected his markers. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Hannah unclipped the badge from her scrubs. Cedar Creek Medical, shift nurse, her photograph staring up at him from the laminate like evidence. She set it on the counter beside a computer terminal without speaking. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. She had learned in Kandahar how to separate the body's involuntary responses from the mind's certainty. Pain was information. So was fear. You noted it and moved forward. Pending investigation, Mercer continued, his voice taking on the texture of something rehearsed. Immediate suspension. You'll be contacted by HR regarding the formal hearing. Don't come back to this hospital until then. Don't call. Don't email. Don't try to access the system. Are we clear? Understood, Hannah said. Her locker was on the 4th floor break room, the one where staff stopped talking whenever she entered, where conversations died mid-sentence and eyes found sudden urgent business with phones and coffee cups. She opened it quickly. Her spare scrubs. A sweater from Target that had cost $12.99. 3 protein bars still in their wrappers. And at the bottom, wrapped in a folded flag, her fallback, her anchor, the last piece of evidence that Captain Hannah Clarke had ever existed at all. A flag that had draped across the coffin of Specialist Marcus Webb, her radio operator, the one she'd tried to carry out of Sanjin Valley on her shoulders for 3 miles with round snapping overhead and his sister going to work every morning in the pediatric ICU 6 floors above her, never knowing who had pressed their hands into her brother's chest wound and refused to let go. Hannah picked up the flag. Felt its weight. Considered the trash can beside the lockers. Considered how easily she could bury this, walk away from everything, start again somewhere else as someone else. Hannah Chen was nobody. Hannah Chen was a quiet nurse who kept her head down. That was a life she could maintain. That was safe. She held the flag for 7 seconds. Then she folded it again and tucked it back against the locker's cold steel wall. The pre-dawn air in Savannah felt different when you were walking away from the only job you'd had in 18 months. The humidity clung to her bloody scrubs. She hadn't changed, hadn't even stopped to rinse the adolescent's blood from her forearms, just walked out with it still tacky against her skin as evidence that something real had happened in there. The parking garage was empty except for her 10-year-old Subaru, the one she'd paid for in cash, the one registered to a Catherine Houston because Hannah Clarke needed to exist as quietly as possible. She drove home with the windows down. The blood dried in the night air, cracking and flaking against her wrists like rust. Ethan was asleep when she arrived. She could hear him through his bedroom door, the particular sound of a 14-year-old's breathing, that adolescent depth that made him sound older than he was. She'd chosen Savannah specifically because it was far enough from everything, because a single mother working nights at a hospital could raise her son without anyone asking questions about his father or her past or why his name was different from hers on the official paperwork. She'd made a life here that was small and quiet and acceptable. A life where nobody looked too closely. Now she sat at the kitchen table still wearing her bloody scrubs. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something else entirely, something that felt like every mission ending simultaneously, every separate identity collapsing into the same version of failure. The fluorescent light above the sink buzzed with the kind of persistence that made you understand why people talked about the sound driving them insane. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry. But her eyes burned like she'd been staring at something too bright for too long. Her shoulders moved like they belonged to someone else, like they were performing a gesture she couldn't control. 18 months of paperwork and charts and careful neutrality, and it had taken 4 minutes in a trauma bay to unravel every precaution. That was when Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was wearing the oversized hoodie he slept in, the one that had belonged to his uncle before Marcus Webb became an absence instead of a person. His hair was in that stage between sleep and consciousness where he still looked young, before the teenage attitude hardened back into place. He stared at his mother sitting at the kitchen table in blood-stained scrubs with her shoulders shaking, and something shifted in his face, not confusion yet, but the beginning of it, the moment before he asked the question that would make everything worse. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Why are you home? What happened?" Hannah didn't look up. Couldn't. Because there was no acceptable explanation for this. There was no version of her life story that made sense to a 14-year-old boy whose father died in a training accident and whose mother had spent every night of his conscious life telling him that work was important, that she was important because the people she helped were important, that sometimes you sacrifice things so that other people could be safe. Now her own son was asking her why she'd abandoned that. Why she was sitting at their kitchen table looking like someone who had failed at the one thing she'd promised to protect, her cover, his normalcy, the careful fiction that they were just like everyone else. "I made a mistake," Hannah said quietly. "At work." Ethan moved closer. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" She looked at him finally. Saw herself in the shape of his jaw, in the way his eyes analyzed problems like he was trying to find the solution, the fixer's logic he'd inherited from her. He was already trying to understand, already trying to solve it, already becoming the kind of person who carried other people's weight because that was what the Clarke family did. The kitchen light hummed its constant frequency. Outside, the pre-dawn Savannah streets were empty, silent, the kind of quiet that existed only in that space between night and morning, when the rest of the world was still sleeping and you were alone with your mistakes. And then her phone vibrated. Just once. A text from an unknown number, "Stand by." The words meant nothing to a 14-year-old boy in an oversized hoodie. They meant everything to Hannah. They meant someone had been listening. Someone had been watching. Someone knew that when a field thoracotomy saved a life using a knife, when a suspended nurse with a perfect documentation trail and a 48-hour window sat in a kitchen with her son, the machinery that had placed her at Cedar Creek Medical in the first place would activate. She didn't know what was about to walk through her front door. The administration conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like burnt coffee and fresh panic. Dr. Mercer stood at the head of the mahogany table, his termination recommendation open in front of him like a surgical instrument, when the doors swung inward. Ethan Clarke was 14 years old, 5'6", with his mother's dark eyes and the kind of quiet resolve that made people step sideways without knowing why. He carried a shadow box against his chest like he was delivering a newborn. "My mom needs you to see something," Ethan said. His voice was steady. Not a request. Not asking permission. The room's air pressure changed. He walked to Mercer's presentation board and set the shadow box down on the mahogany conference table with a kind of deliberate precision that suggested military bearing had already found its way into his 14-year-old bones. Inside the frame, a silver star. A bronze star with velar device. 2 purple hearts arranged like bookends around her name engraved on the black velvet backing. The medals caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like accusations. "She never told us," Ethan said quietly. "She just came home bloody this morning." Commander James Reeves lay in bed 16, morphine still clouding his cognition, but the moment his eyes registered those particular medals and that particular face entering the conference room behind her son, memory and pharmacology aligned like a surgical laser finding its target. His breath caught. His hand moved to his left arm where the name Valkyrie was tattooed across 347 days of scar tissue. "Valkyrie?" His voice came out broken. Actual recognition. Not hallucination. Not the morphine-soaked confusion that had occupied his previous encounters with the quiet night nurse who checked his vitals at 0300 without meeting his eyes. Hannah Clarke stood in the doorway wearing civilian clothes for the first time in 72 hours, jeans, a grey sweater, her hair pulled back in a way that exposed the scar along her left temple where shrapnel had nearly made her a permanent resident of Walter Reed instead of Cedar Creek Medical. She did not move. Did not flinch. Did not acknowledge Reeves. Her jaw tightened barely perceptibly. Dr. Mercer's face was still trying to process the medals when the hospital's Marine Corps liaison, Major Thomas Halloway, stepped forward with a leather folder that smelled like government seals and classified briefings. His uniform was dress blues. His boots were polished to a mirror finish. He opened the folder and began reading with the cadence of someone who had testified before Congress. Captain Hannah Clarke. Silver Star. Citation reads, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Helmand province. Repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to extract wounded personnel. Sustained injuries consistent with improvised explosive device fragmentation while maintaining tactical position to establish casualty evacuation route. Major Holloway looked up directly at Mercer. Captain. Not nurse. Captain. The word hung in the room like a scalpel suspended mid-incision. Dr. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. His hand reached for something that wasn't there, a phone, a document, a lifeline. I was not informed, this is irregular. You were informed nothing, Major Holloway continued, because this officer's assignment at Cedar Creek Medical was authorized by Naval Intelligence Directorate. She was not here to practice nursing, doctor. She was here to monitor a specific patient and gather intelligence related to potential war crimes testimony. Your actions, your fabricated disciplinary record, your public humiliation, your systematic campaign of isolation, have compromised a federal investigation. The door opened again. This time it was Rear Admiral Christopher Maxwell, Reeves' former commanding officer, in dress white so crisp they could have cut. He did not shake hands. He did not speak. He approached the shadow box containing Hannah's medals, placed his right hand over his heart, and executed a full salute to the decorations rather than the woman. The gesture was so formal, so absolute, that even Mercer understood he was witnessing a moment of military protocol that transcended his entire worldview. Captain Clarke has the gratitude of the United States Navy, Rear Admiral Maxwell said quietly. And the gratitude of every Marine and SEAL who came home because of her actions in Helmand province. What happened next ended Dr. Mercer's career. Not because of the naval intelligence disclosure. Not because of his fabricated charges. But because of what had already gone viral 12 hours earlier, the video a veteran's daughter had recorded in room 407, the one showing Mercer's face purple with rage, his voice screaming accusations of medication errors at a grieving widow, his finger pointed at Hannah like she was less than human. That video had reached his medical school mentor at Johns Hopkins at 2:02 a.m. Dr. Richard Harrison, the man who had recommended Mercer for his position at Cedar Creek, had issued a public statement on the hospital's surgical board. I do not recognize the physician in this video. I do not endorse his methods. I do not claim association with his practice. One surgeon's disavowal. That was all it took. The board review triggered within 6 hours. The billing audit that followed revealed $847,000 in kickbacks from Medtronic for unnecessary device implantations. The calls from the hospital's legal team started coming in at irregular intervals. The state medical board initiated its investigation by Wednesday. 6 months later, Dr. Marcus Mercer was spotted in a strip mall urgent care clinic in Tucson, Arizona, mopping the bathroom tile at closing time. His name tag read, Steve. When a patient called him doctor, he flinched. His hands shook as he wrung out the mop in a plastic bucket. $15 per hour teaching CPR fundamentals to high school students who had no idea they were learning from a cardiologist. His medical license was gone. His reputation was historical. His future had been reduced to the sound of water sloshing in a mop bucket. But that was still to come. In the present moment, in Bed 16 at Cedar Creek Medical, Commander James Reeves watched Hannah turn to leave the administration conference room. Her son followed 3 steps behind, carrying the shadow box back toward his chest like it was armor. Reeves tried to sit up. The fall line tangled. His surgical drain shifted and pain lanced through his sternum, the kind of pain that cuts through morphine if it's sharp enough. It was sharp enough. Hannah stopped. Turned. Walked back to his bedside alone. Ethan waited in the hallway outside the curtain partition, giving them privacy the way soldiers understand privacy, as something earned, not given. She reached into her sweater pocket and withdrew a folded flag. Not her own. Not the one that had been presented to her after Helmand province. This one was different. This one carried the weight of someone else's absence. She placed it in his hands with the kind of gentleness reserved for things that cannot be broken further because they have already broken in every way possible. Petty Officer Michael Reeves, she said quietly. His brother's name. The one who had been in the same SEAL unit. The one who hadn't made it out of that valley. His sister works pediatrics. 3rd floor. She never knew who found him. Who tried to save him. Who carried his body 3 kilometers to the extraction point and wouldn't leave until the last man was accounted for. Reeves looked at the folded flag in his hands. Then he looked up at Hannah's face. His eyes, finally, saw past the nurse uniform and hospital ID badge and the careful distance she maintained. He saw the woman who had promised him "I've got you" when the world was blood and dust and dying light. He saw the eyes that had never wavered. The hands that had held him together when everything else was coming apart. "You didn't tell me you were here," he whispered. "The mission required silence," Hannah said. "But that part's over now." She turned to leave. Reeves reached for her hand, just barely touched her wrist where her pulse moved steady as a sinus rhythm. Not a question. Just an acknowledgement that they had both survived something that should have killed them, and the world had arranged things so they could see each other across the distance of years and morphine and military protocol and finally recognize what they had always known. The doors to Cedar Creek Medical opened that evening to camera flashes and federal agents in windbreakers. The hospital board announced a comprehensive review of cardiac procedures from the previous 18 months. A new trauma wing was authorized for funding, dedicated to treating uninsured veterans. Hannah Clarke was offered the position of Chief of Trauma Services with a salary that would have made her comfortable anywhere. She wore her scrubs to the first day at the job. Dark blue. Wrinkled from the hospital wash. Her stethoscope hung around her neck like it had for 15 years. She checked vitals on a patient in room 4, then room 5, then room 6. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife at midnight in a foreign province. Her voice was quiet when she gave orders. Her decisions were absolute. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how much power you carry and choosing, every single day, not to use it unless lives depend on it. Reeves was discharged on a Thursday. Hannah signed his discharge papers at the nurse's station. Their fingers touched briefly over the document. Neither of them looked up. But later, when she clocked out at 7 in the morning after a 14-hour shift, she found him waiting in the parking lot beside a truck with a new paint job and temporary tags. He held the door open. She got in. Neither of them spoke during the drive to the harbor where the Atlantic was just starting to turn gold with dawn light. They sat on a weathered bench that smelled like salt and creosote. His arm found her shoulder. Her head found the place where his shoulder met his neck. Two people who had carried each other through the absolute worst the world had to offer, finally permitted to sit still. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Subscribe for more stories of the quiet warriors walking among us. And if you know someone like Captain Clarke, someone carrying a weight they've never mentioned, maybe it's time to ask them what they're really made of.